Wow. I wish you could taste it through the screen. Perfect spring cake. In this video, I'm going to show you how to make the most delicious Rhubarb Entremet cake that is perfect for beginners. I love rhubarb and it's finally rhubarb season, so I'm really excited to show you how to create this beginners friendly entremet cake where I show you step by step all the layers and I give you all my best to how to succeed making entremet cakes. The cake consists of a blondie with rhubarb, a rhubarb ganache and a rhubarb mousse, and on top I have some different chocolate decoration. But before we get started, let's talk just briefly about the terminology for this kind of cake. So an entremet cake is a cake that consists of multiple components, so several layers usually with different textures, which is encased by a mousse, in this case a rhubarb mousse. And then there is typically some sort of decoration, so there can be glaze, velvet spray, this kind of chocolate decoration. So that's what we mean when we say it's an entremet cake. Inside we have a rhubarb blondie, meaning that it's kind of like a brownie, but just with white chocolate, and then I have added rhubarb to make it even more fresh. This is one of my favorite recipes for cake bases. I use it in a lot of my recipes, so this one is a safe bet, I would say. The rhubarb ganache is made out of 3 ingredients, which is rhubarb puree, heavy cream and white chocolate. So by mixing these 3 things, you get a very rich and fudgy consistency that fits perfect into an entremet cake like this one. And lastly, we have the rhubarb mousse, which is a mousse and not a whipped ganache. And you might have heard these 2 different things before, and it is 2 different things. Because when we talk about a mousse like this one, you mix the fruit puree with lightly whipped cream straight away. And that gives a very airy and light consistency. Whereas when you make a whipped ganache, it needs to set overnight and you don't whip the cream until the next day. And that gives a very thick and creamy consistency, but it's less airy and light, so it's a bit more difficult to use an entremet cake like this one where you want it to be very sharp. You want to have these like very sharp edges from silicone mold. So that's why I use this kind of mousse in all my entremet cakes that I use in my normal recipes. To make the rhubarb cake, I am gonna use a silicone mold, and this one is from Silkomart. It's called Tor. I'm also gonna link it in the description. What important is just that it's an 18 centimeter diameter. So this is the one that I use. And otherwise I have here 2 sets of pastry rings. And this is really just to bake the rhubarb cake itself. You can also use a spring form or spring pan if you have that. You just need a size 16 centimeter diameter because that is gonna be the same size as a cake. And just the way that I like to do it is to use the pastry ring to bake the actual dough. And then I use a slightly bigger pastry ring, an 18 centimeter diameter, to use around the cake so the dough doesn't run out. I will also illustrate how to do this, but it's just to say that this is the equipment that I use. And I will also illustrate, if you don't have the silicone mold, how you can use a pastry ring like this as well. For the rhubarb cake, we need 60 grams of sugar, 65 grams of butter, 65 grams of white chocolate, 45 grams of all-purpose flour, 1 egg, 35 grams of chopped white chocolate, 35 grams of rhubarb, either fresh or frozen, 35 grams of chopped almonds, and a bit of salt. I start out by melting the butter. Now that all the butter is melted, as you can see, I'm just gonna pour it like in this one, and then we will put it aside. Then we are melting the 65 grams of white chocolate. I'm just gonna melt the chocolate in this pot because I find that that's easier. But if you haven't melted chocolate before or it's not that familiar to you, I recommend that you use a water bath instead, because then you can easier control the temperature. But I'm just gonna do it at a very low heat, as you can see here, where I just keep stirring it. Now that the chocolate is melted, as you can see here, I'm just gonna pour it back into the small bowl because we're gonna put it aside while we make the rest of the dough. We're now gonna make sugar flour, egg, and a bit of salt in this bowl. Also egg and it's like a pinch of salt. So we're gonna whisk it all together with this electric mixer. You can see here it's getting this like light consistency, but we want it to be a bit more fluffy. We want to be able to see a bit of air bubbles in the surface. So I'm just gonna give it a bit more on high speed. You can see now it has this like very airy consistency. It's also light and fluffy, and that's exactly the consistency we want. So you know it's whipped enough when you can see a few air bubbles in the dough in the surface, and it has this like very fluffy but also light color and this consistency. We're now gonna mix in the melted butter, the melted chocolate we melted earlier. So you can see I'm just mixing it with a rubber spatula. Not like over stirring, but just making sure it's combined. Because that ensures that we will keep this more fluffy consistency and not taking any air out of the dough. You can see now it's getting this very smooth, glossy texture, which is exactly what we want. And now we're gonna add the chopped chocolate. As you can see, I've just done it like very roughly because it gives a nice crunch, so don't chop it too fine. And the same with the almonds I have here, also you can see, very roughly chopped to give a bit more crunch. So we're mixing this together. Now you can see it's all mixed in and it has still this like very light and fluffy texture, full of crunch. Now we need to pour the dough into the pastry. And as I said, I prefer using pastry more than a spring pan, but you can use whatever you prefer. And I'm gonna use a 16 centimeter diameter because that is what fits with the cake. So to make sure that, because this doesn't have like a bottom, that the dough doesn't run out, I always use this in combination with a bigger pastry size. So this is 18, this is 16. So what I do is that I take the big one, I put this on this one to put in the oven. So the big one, you put below, take one piece of parchment paper, and then I take the smaller one and put on top, and I fold the parchment paper around it. When I've done that, I fold the parchment paper out again, like this. And then we can kind of cut off the excess. So you can now see in this way, we have the pastry ring, but it is covered in the bottom with parchment paper, and the bigger pastry ring is kind of holding in the dough and the parchment paper. Now I'm just applying a bit of butter or oil here. So you can either use a bit of oil or butter around your pan, the pastry ring here, and it's just to make sure that the dough can come out and it's not sticking too much. Now I'm gonna pour the dough into the pastry ring. I'm just using the spatula to make sure that it's like evenly divided. The surface is roughly even. And now the last step is to take the rhubarb and just gently press them down in the dough. And don't press all the way down because then they will reach the bottom. And we want basically the bottom to be the dough itself. So just make sure it doesn't stick up too much, but still pressing it down, because the dough will also rise a bit. As you can see, I've now put all the rhubarb into the dough, and now the next step is really just to bake the cake in the oven. So now as you can see, the rhubarb cake is done. It has this like golden surface. And if you're unsure if it's baked enough, you can always use a fork to test to see if there is any cake dough left on it. Then it needs a bit more. You can see here there is only a bit of like crumbs on it, and that is perfect. So now I'm just gonna set this outside to cool for a bit. Here we take away the bigger pastry ring. And here you can see that the dough has been kept inside because of the ring outside and because of the parchment paper. So now we want to release the cake from the pastry ring. I'm going to use this knife just to cut around, and then we will lift it. And now we can lift it. Now that we have our cake here, we need to put it in a clean pastry ring. So I just cleaned the pastry ring that I also used to bake it with. And then you can either place the pastry ring on a plate that fits like this, or you can take a chopping board. So what I always do is that I first take the same parchment paper so we can reuse it. But we first need to release the cake. So since this is cool, it's going to be set enough for me to do this. Taking off the paper, putting it here. And here we will have our pastry ring. Now I'm just going to put the cake here just for a second while we add baking acetate sheet inside. And this is really just to make sure that we get a smooth cut when we take this insert out of the freezer, because if you take it without the acetate sheet, it will probably stick to this middle ring, and it just, yeah, sometimes that can ruin the layers and it's just annoying to take off. So I always use this, and I will also here add like a clip, or you can also use tape, whatever is right for you. And now we take the cake and gently press down like this. If you want to make sure you have a fully equal surface, I sometimes use a glass like this, which is just flat at the bottom, to like gently tap around here, not too much because you don't want to punch out the air of this fluffy, airy cake that we have. But we just want to make sure that it's leveled, so when we cut the cake, it has a clean cut. So usually it's a bit bigger either in the middle or on the side. So this is why you will just gently press it down a bit to make sure it's even everywhere. You can also use a spoon like this if you find that that's easier. To make the rhubarb ganache, we need 170 grams of white chocolate, 55 milliliters of rhubarb puree made from either fresh or frozen rhubarb. So here I have approximately 150 grams of rhubarb because that is sufficient to make 55 milliliters. And lastly, I have 30 milliliters of heavy cream. We start out by melting the white chocolate. I'm just melting it over the stove here on a very low heat, but if you're new to melting chocolate or you're worried to not being able to control the temperature as much or split the chocolate, you can use a water bath. But if you do use a stove like me, just have it on the lowest heat or the second to lowest heat to make sure you can control the temperature and then it doesn't get too hot. Now that the chocolate is melted, I'm gonna pour it into this bowl. And then we're gonna put this aside while we make the rhubarb puree. Now we are gonna make the rhubarb puree. So I'm gonna take here the fresh rhubarbs I have and put in the pot. And now we're just gonna heat it up until the rhubarbs are very tender. And this may take a while, so it's good to have a bit of patience. And then it's important just to stir it while it cooks to make sure that it doesn't burn. If you're using fresh rhubarb like me and they're like a bit more dry because they're not like defrosting like when you use frozen ones, you can add a bit of water if you find that it sticks to the pot, and it's just really gonna help getting a bit more juice out of the rhubarb. You can see now it's getting more, they're starting to get tender, but we want it to be so tender that you can basically smush or like crush the rhubarbs just with the spoon, and then it's supposed to be splashed under the spoon. So you can see now I still have big clumps, so I can't really do that. They're still like not cooked enough. So I'm gonna give it some more. Now that it's starting to be almost cooked, I'm using a small whisker instead, because in this way I can easier whisk out the clumps that's left. And it's very important that it's tender enough, because if you still have these clumps and it's not cooked enough, you will not be able to basically make a puree in the sieve, because a rhubarb puree is very thick as it is. So we really need to get it as much puree as we can by making this very tender and properly cooked. As you can see here, we now have the rhubarb being fully cooked. Here I'm now using this refined sieve and just a small bowl under. And we're gonna scrape the rhubarb like this, and using the small hand whisker to get the actual puree. And what is tricky about this puree is that it's not like when you make raspberries or blueberry, where it's like very thin. Rhubarb is very thick. As you can see, most of it right now is actually under the sieve. So you really need to be very thorough, and it can take a while for it to actually get out. But you can see, as I'm continuously whisking and pressing down, you can see the puree is starting to come. And we can also use a spoon, spatula or something else to scrape like this, just to help it a bit. You can now see here we have a very smooth, 100% pure rhubarb puree. So as I said, it's really about just pressing down, making sure the rhubarbs are cooked enough, and then you will get this smooth puree texture that we need for our ganache. I'm now taking this measure cup to measure the 55 milliliters that we need. Now we are gonna mix the heavy cream with the rhubarb puree and heat it here over the stove. And we only want it to be heated only almost to a boil. So only almost to the boiling point, so not actually boiling, but just right before, only a few boiling bubbles. So we do it at very low heat, because what can go wrong here is if you heat it at a too high heat, it gets too hot, and you put over the chocolate, it will split. And there's really nothing you can do to save it. It's really tricky. So that's why we don't want this mixture to be too hot. Now that I can see it's smoking, I saw there was 1 or 2 bubbles, I know that it's ready. So I'm gonna move this to the side and take the chocolate we melted earlier. And as I said, normally when you make other kinds of ganache with fruit, it is usually thinner than this mixture. But because we are making it with rhubarb, which is thicker, this puree is going to be more thick than normal. So we will pour it while stirring in the middle of the chocolate with a rubber spatula. So you want to stir it in the middle until it gets this like very glossy, shiny consistency. If you boiled the heavy cream and the puree too hot and you poured it over the chocolate, you would see that this would split. So this is really just what you need to watch out for when you make a ganache. Don't make the cream you add to the chocolate too hot. And then you stir it in the middle until it gets glossy. If you want to make sure that your ganache is fully smooth, it's a great idea to hand blend it. I always do that. So I pour it into a plastic pitcher. Now we're taking the hand blender, putting it down at an angle to avoid making too many air bubbles, and then just blend. So You can skip this step if you don't have a hand blender, but if you do, I would really recommend it because it really does a difference for the consistency. It's way more silky smooth when you blend it versus when you don't blend it. So now we can see we have this smooth rhubarb ganache to put on top of the rhubarb cake. We're gonna pour our ganache on top. And I'm just tapping it gently here with the spatula to make sure that it's even distributed. You can also tap it like this to make sure it's evenly distributed and you don't have any air bubbles. Now we are gonna put this in the freezer where it needs to set fully overnight. It needs to be fully frozen before we can put it into the rhubarb mousse. To make the rhubarb mousse, we need 260 grams of rhubarb, either fresh or frozen. I am using fresh rhubarb. 100 grams of caster sugar. 300 milliliters of heavy cream. 1 teaspoon of vanilla paste or 1 vanilla bean where you use the seeds. 2 tablespoons of lemon juice. And lastly, 3 gelatin sheets, bloom value 240. The first thing we need to do is to soak the gelatin in cold water. And this is just cold tap water. And it's important that you put the sheets down one at a time, so not all of them at the same time, because then they won't soak properly. So one at a time, gently put them down. And then they need to soak here while you prepare the rhubarb puree and the sugar in a pot. The next step is to mix all the ingredients and heat them up until the rhubarb is cooked. So we're taking the rhubarb, the sugar, lemon juice, 1 teaspoon of vanilla paste or vanilla seeds from a fresh vanilla bean, whatever you prefer. And then we're just gonna start the cooking. So I'm putting here my stove at a medium to high heat, because we want to heat up and cook the rhubarb. And to begin with, I'm just going to use a spoon to stir because it's a bit easier when the rhubarb is still not cooked. So as you can see, I'm just really mixing now the ingredients slowly at a medium to high heat. You see now it's starting to get more tender and cooked, but we still have a lot of big pieces. So I am switching to the biscuit here to start stirring out the big clumps, because we're gonna sift it afterwards, so it's okay if there's still some, but it is easier if you have a more smooth mixture here in the end. And you also want to make sure that all the parts are cooked and tender. So now we can see we have a puree of rhubarb where it's fully cooked and tender. So we're just gonna remove this one, and then we need to put it through a sieve to make sure we don't have any clumps. Since rhubarb has a more thick consistency, it's different when you cook blueberry, raspberry. You will get a more liquid puree out. We need to stir a lot because we want to get as much as we can out of this rhubarb mixture. So just keep stirring to get as much as we can. And since it's quite thick, it can help to like clean the bottom here with a spoon or spatula, whatever you have. Then it's easier to get more puree out. Now I can see I've gotten all the puree out I can, so we have some excess here. And this you can actually save and use as a compote. It's quite acidic without added sugar, just as it is now. You can use it like this if you want, but if you want to make a compote to put on your breakfast or whatever, you can actually save this, and you just add a bit of sugar when you heat it up, and then it tastes amazing for breakfast actually. So don't toss this away, you can use it for something else. Now that we have our puree ready here, we will add the gelatin that we have soaked from earlier. I'm just gonna squeeze out the water and add this to our hot mixture. The thing about gelatin is that it needs to be soaked properly, so you cannot do it in hot water, you need to do it in cold water. It needs to be for 5 to 10 minutes so it fits with while you make this puree. And you need to make sure that this mixture is still hot. If it's not hot, the gelatin will not dissolve. So you need to kind of time these processes, not waiting too long after this is being sifted to actually add the gelatin. So try to do it straight away to make sure you won't have any clumps or anything strings of the gelatin, but that it's fully dissolved. So you will get a puree that looks like this. I am now transferring the puree into a bigger bowl because we need to later on mix with the heavy cream. So just making sure we get everything. So now we have our mixture here in a bowl, and then this one needs to cool to room temperature. I usually put it outside, or you can just have it on the table where you stir it once in a while. Most important is just that it's not too hot, because what we will do next is to whip the heavy cream, and then we will mix these two things together. And if this one is too hot, it will split or separate the cream, and we don't want that to happen, because if that happens, you need to start over. So just let this cool to lukewarm or to room temperature. Now, while the rhubarb puree is cooling, we're gonna whip our heavy cream. And it's important that we don't whip it too much. We only want it to be whipped until soft peaks, because otherwise you will get a mousse that is more grainy and not like silky smooth, which is what we want. We want an airy, smooth mousse. So you can see now the mousse is starting to get more airy, but still when I take the whiskers down here, I don't see a pattern, and we want it to fall just very slightly soft peaks. So when you take it up, you're supposed to see some soft peaks form, and here it's still too liquid, so we're gonna whip it a bit more, but not a lot, so just keep an eye out. Now I can see if I take the whisker down, there is some soft peaks forming just very slightly. And I can also see it has this like thicker consistency, but it's not whipped cream. That's a big difference. You only want to whip it lightly to soft peaks. So always do a test. Take the whiskers down here. When you take them up, you can see there is like a small pattern left. And that's when you know, okay, now it's done. And you can also see it has a more thick consistency, but not too thick. Now we're gonna mix the heavy cream, the whipped cream, into our cooled rhubarb mass. So as I mentioned, it's really important that you let this cool to room temperature, because if it's too hot, it will separate the cream that we just whipped. So always start just doing 1/4 or 1/3 of the cream, because then you will make sure that this is combined before you add the rest. So just take a small part, mix it, and make sure this is fully mixed. And then you can fold in the rest. And here we're really folding the cream. We're not like whisking, because that can beat out the air of the mousse. We're just folding it and gently mixing it. You will see when you make fruit mousses like this one with rhubarb, blueberry, strawberry or rhubarb here, that it has a thicker consistency compared to when you do a chocolate mousse. It's gonna be more runny. And that is because we're mixing the fruit puree with the heavy cream. You get this like thick consistency. Now we have a beautiful rhubarb mousse that has this like very pale pink color for the natural rhubarb. It's a very creamy consistency that is perfect to use for entremet cakes. Now the last step is to put the mousse into the silicone mold and put the frozen cake down in the mousse to make an entremet cake. And for this, as I mentioned earlier, I am using this 18 cm diameter Silicomat Tor mold. But you can also use others. It's just important that it's the same size in the diameter, otherwise you need to adjust the recipe. So I'm putting this on a chopping board. And then we're just gonna pour the mousse down. Making sure we have everything. And now we want to make sure that it's fully distributed, especially because this is a thicker mousse. So we don't get any air bubbles. You can tap it like this. I here have the cake that is fully frozen. It's been sitting in the freezer overnight. So removing the pastry and the acetate sheet. And this is why we use the acetate sheet. It's so we can get it out of the mold very easily. So now we're gonna take the frozen cake and put down in the mousse. And because we're gonna basically flip this mold when the cake is fully done, we wanna put the frozen insert down in the mousse with the Rhubarb Ganache facing downwards. Otherwise you're gonna have your cake upside down. So we take the frozen cake like this. Flip it in your hands. So the ganache is facing downwards. And then we place it in the middle and gently pressing down like this until you can see that the cake is down and it's kind of like leveling the mold itself. So just to make sure it's fully even, I'm just using this small palette knife to even the layer and remove the excess. Then the cake needs to freeze fully overnight, so I'm gonna put it back in the freezer until tomorrow. Now that the cake has been sitting overnight, I just took it out of the freezer and we're now gonna remove it from the mold. The easiest way to do it is to gently release the sides first, like this, so you can see it's kind of already loose. And then you hold at the top or where you get the best grip. And you kind of take one side off first, and then the rest will come off by itself. So you can see here, I have a perfectly shaped cake. And it's a good idea just to run your fingers on the bottom, then you get a fully sharp cut. So now I'm just gonna place it here onto the cake platter where it will defrost in the fridge. And that usually takes, depending on how many layers you have, 3 to 6 hours in the fridge. While the cake here is gonna defrost in the fridge, I am going to start preparing the decoration. You can serve the cake just as it is. I just love always decorating with chocolate decoration. It's like my signature way of decorating cakes. So I'm gonna use some of my very favorite decoration. On this cake, it's gonna be a chocolate ribbon going around the cake and chocolate rings on top of the cake. If you wanna learn how to do the decorations, you can check out my online chocolate decoration courses that I'm also gonna link in the description, where I teach you how to temper chocolate with 2 different methods. So whether you're more new to this or you're more routine, there is 2 different ways of doing it. And I'm showing how to do my very 10 favorite decorations that I use on all my cakes. Now that the chocolate ribbon I made has set, I'm just gonna remove the acetate sheet very gently. And then we are going to place it around the cake. So just with a very steady hand, put it down. And then use the finger to find the middle here in the front. Make sure that it's covered. And then you kind of fold it around the cake. It's kind of like, it always makes me think of dressing the cake, giving it on like a dress or something. Because now it looks perfectly framed. And then we're gonna put the rings on the top of the cake. For the rings, I'm also gonna remove the acetate sheet. And here we have a lot of beautiful rings you can use. I usually use around 3 on the top, but you can always save the rest. So I'm just gonna take 3 here. And these ones, I'm just gonna place in the middle. And then you can try to see if you put the end. So I'm putting the end of the chocolate ribbon here. I'm gonna try to roughly put the same ends here, because when you present the cake, you can put it this way and then you have the ends facing the same way. And the last one. You can use a little of melted chocolate if you want to fasten these ends here. But I'm gonna decorate this top with flowers anyway, so that's gonna cover a bit as well. So here we go. This is our Rhubarb Entremet. I'm gonna decorate with some flowers. Of course, that's also optional. You can serve it like this or without any decoration. It's fully up to you. It's just, yeah, very much my thing to decorate with chocolate and then flowers. It's just the kind of aesthetic that I like to put on my cakes. Here I have some different flowers, edible flowers. And I'm using a bit of glucose syrup here just to fasten them so they don't slide off. And the way I always do it is that I face the front of the cake the way you're gonna present it, and then the back here, because then it's just easier to see what it's gonna look like from the right angle when you actually serve it. And I usually take more flowers than what I need, because for example, I see this one is not exactly matching the color. So it's nice just also to have some options like these ones to put on. And people often ask me where I find the flowers, and it's a mix of in the nature. I often find them in nature or at a flower shop. Depends on the season. In the autumn, it's definitely more difficult because nothing is blooming really. But now in the spring, all my favorite flowers are actually in season, which is this one. To be honest, I'm not sure what it's called in English, but in Danish, I'm from Denmark, where I'm from, it's called a stemmerblomst. This is the final cake, which is a perfect beginner's cake if you haven't made this kind of entremet or multi-layer cake before, as it has all the main elements of an entremet cake. Cake base, ganache, mousse and decoration. Now we have made it to my very favorite part of the cake baking, and that is to actually taste the cake. So if you want to get a sharp cut, what is important is to have a sharp knife that is hot. So I usually either run it under hot water and dry it, or you can also use a hair dryer. And then you just put it down in the middle. And since we have the chocolate here, you can do this kind of crack. Otherwise you can kind of like smush mousse. This one. This rhubarb cake contains the perfect flavor balance and texture with a delicious blondie, a fudgy ganache and a silky smooth mousse. And to the very last, and actually the most important step, is to eat and taste the cake. Wow. It's really good. It's like super fresh with the rhubarb. I actually don't like too sweet cakes, so I always try to minimize sugar in my recipes. And for this one with rhubarb, I also want it to be a fresh cake. It's really good in combination with the blondie, with the rhubarb. That also kind of balances the flavors of it, so it's not too sour or acidic. Perfect spring cake. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed it. And if you would like to see more recipes and tutorials, make sure to subscribe to my channel. And you can also check out my website where you can find all my recipes and my chocolate decoration courses. See you in the next video.